Hey everyone, I'm Dr. Andrea Kita and I'm a folklorist, and today I'm going to talk to you about haunted houses, both in popular culture and in the oral tradition. So first thing I want you to do is just close your eyes and picture a haunted house, okay? Probably looks a little bit like this. So we know that this sort of image of the haunted house has been pretty consistent for about the past 200 years, which is pretty impressive if you really think about it. That two-story house, it's got the creepy tree out front, the little cemetery, the little graveyard in the front. It's got the broken down windows and the moon and all of these sort of things. That's been a pretty consistent image, and it's been constantly reinforced in both popular culture and folklore. So that to the point where when we see a house that looks like that, we assume it's haunted, right? Because we've seen this house. We've seen this house a lot of times. So we know that that's what a haunted house is supposed to look like. So we're really attached to our homes. And this is part of the reason why the haunted house is so scary to us, right? It's because we're so attached to our houses. And it's weird for us to think about that place, sort of our ultimate safe space, being haunted or being a place that's threatening, which is pretty interesting because if you actually think about it, most of our horrors actually do come from the house. So it is interesting that we think of this as an outlier, that our home is always a sanctuary, when a lot of times for many people, home isn't a sanctuary. But that's the way we like to think of it, right? So this is part of the reason why the haunted house is so terrifying to us. So it is that idea of someone invading that space that is supposed to be our private space, our safe space, right? And that's what makes us so scared of the haunted house. We know too in haunted house stories, especially in popular culture, that people come away from the experience changed. Especially if we look at some of the different movies over the years. Usually after the family survives the haunted house, something about them is fundamentally changed. They might have changed in appearance, going along with the folkloric hair gun white motif that we see in the original Poltergeist, or it might be something more dramatic even than that, so that the family itself may have less members of it. Some of them might not have survived, but most of the time, most of the family does survive in a lot of these stories. But they come away fundamentally changed in some sort of way. They can't ignore what they know now, right? We also see that the haunted house is actually an active participant, and sometimes it actually works together with the ghost. So it's not just that the house just is there and existing, it's actually doing things, right? The house is changing, or things are moving in it, or somehow the house is also sort of an active participant in these stories. Which is pretty interesting when we think about it. And it's really interesting too if we think about the way we talk about our homes, especially if you're in the process of looking at a home or building or buying a home. There's a lot of terminology that's used that is pretty weird when you think about it. So people talk about houses having good bones, which is kind of odd to think about. Why would we say bones, right? Instead of structure, or is structurally sound, but we say good bones. We also say things like that houses need to breathe, which that's a little weird too to think about, but a lot of times you'll hear that terminology used, that houses need to breathe. You'll hear, all this other kind of stuff that kind of talks about the house as if it's a living entity. And I think in some ways we do think of our houses as being alive, or at least being part of us, or an extension of us, which is why, again, the haunted house is so scary. If we also think about how these houses have kind of worked over time, it's one of those things where we think about the people who live in them. When we see a really big house, the general public is not always going to live in a house like that, right? So we see that big mansion on the hill, and we sit there and we wonder, what are these people's lives like? What's going on there? And sometimes, we play a little game with ourselves. We think about oh, their lives must be terrible. And it is out of a little bit out of jealousy, probably in some ways, but we're oh, I bet they do weird stuff in there. I bet there's weird things going on. I bet, at the very least, it's haunted. So their lives aren't perfect. And that kind of gives us a little bit of a release too, to kind of think about. But we'd look at these big homes the general public would not normally be in, and we'd sort of wonder, what's going on there? I bet weird stuff happens in there. So that's part of it. And I think this is also, especially in North America, this is our version of the European castle, right? Those big, especially Victorian type mansions are what we look at and think, okay, this is our version of a giant castle, because we don't necessarily have a lot of castles in North America. So especially when the house is run down, it doesn't just represent the rich, but it also represents failure. And I think that's one of the scarier things. When we really think about looking at a rundown house, especially a big rundown house, we wonder what went wrong, right? What did they do that we can prevent ourselves? So when we see that, it's not just about the big scary house. It's about the big scary house that used to be nice, that used to be something that was really well taken care of, but that something big fundamentally happened and fortunes were lost and these people became failures. So what happened, and how do we avoid that too, is part of what we wonder when we wonder like something like this about whether or not what happened. So that's kind of another thing I think we think about, is that the haunted house also represents failure in a lot of different ways. A lot of times when we see haunted house movies, a lot of the action takes place in the basement or the attic. And that's always so strange, I think, when we're watching these movies. We're like, why do they keep running upstairs, right? Like, why don't they run outside and get away from it? But that sometimes, in some cases, that's impossible. But it also kind of represents this sort of idea that you're running to kind of the edges of the house, right? And some people actually believe that's an interpretation too of trying to get to heaven. It's like the up is a good place, down is a bad place kind of general feeling. I don't know how much I buy that, but it's possible. So I think that's one of the things that a lot of times we see a character run up the stairs, up the liminal staircase, to the roof, and they try to get out on the roof. And that happens in a lot of these scary movies, where they run out to the roof and they try to get escape from there, which seems very improbable. It's like, why don't you just run out from the downstairs? I don't understand. But sometimes the house does make this impossible to do, so I'll try not to be too judgy. A lot of times too, people run to the basement. If they run to the basement, usually that's bad stuff's going to happen, right? We know that, because the basement is a scary place. We think of it as being maybe a little too close to hell, if you want to go with that analogy again. But yeah, usually bad things happen in the basement, right? This is where we bury the bodies, so on and so forth. So that usually does not turn out well in these kind of movies. If we think about it some more, from that notion of those liminal spaces, so basements, attics, staircases, there are places that are referred to as in betwixt and in between. So a liminal space is any space that doesn't really fit into what we think of as one thing or another, right? So the basement, the attic, these are places in our houses that are like part of our houses, but they're kind of not. We don't really live in them. We don't really do stuff with them. It's kind of the same thing with stairs. They're literally even between floors. So they're not upstairs, they're not downstairs, they're kind of in between. And even hallways to some extent too. So we see a lot of spooky hallways. Because hallways really aren't, like, you don't live in the hallway, right? So it's not really a part of your house, but it is a part of your house. So these are all kind of considered to be liminal spaces. So a lot of times we do see that the ghosts show up in these liminal spaces, because like these spaces, they're also in betwixt and in between. They're not alive, they're dead, but they're not gone. So it's like they're kind of in an in-between state too. So that's where they tend to show up in these houses, especially in movies. But we also see that in the oral tradition as well. And there's a lot of differences when we really think about the oral tradition versus what we see in popular culture. So in popular culture, in the haunted house, usually there's sort of an escalating series of events, right? Something small happens, and then something bigger, and then something bigger, and then something bigger, right? So it's always this sort of thing where it goes from small to bigger. So there's an escalating series of events. And then usually what happens in these is in the climax, the family normally does get away. They might lose a member or two, or sometimes they lose a pet as a representation of a member of the family. But usually it ends in the family escaping, and then the house either being destroyed or blinking out of existence, or the house continues to be there and is continuing kind of as a threat, and it kind of goes to the ongoing nature of evil in the world, right? So we have this idea that, like, this family got away, but what about the next one? So it really kind of gives you that idea that evil kind of continues on unless it's utterly destroyed. That's not exactly how things work in the oral tradition. A lot of times in ghost stories, we don't see that series of escalating events. We just sort of see these series of stories that sometimes get better and sometimes get worse. But it's usually a lot more about the feel than it is about seeing. Now, of course, in a movie, it's a visual form of culture, so we see things and we hear things in movies, right? That's the way they're designed. But in the oral tradition, it's a lot more about feel. So it's like, what did it feel like? And very rarely do you actually hear people talk about seeing something. A lot of times they think they saw something. It's not like the sort of full body apparition that you see in the movies, but it's more of like an impression that something is there, a feel that something's not quite right. So you hear a lot more about that in the oral tradition than you do in necessarily in movies. And in movies, it's also kind of hard to talk about that. So you might see something like the person breathes and there's clearly a cold spot because they can't make you feel the cold spot, right? So that's kind of how they do that in that type of a form of storytelling. But again, in the oral tradition, most of that, it doesn't involve these escalating series of events. It's more about like, these are all the things that have happened. And a lot of them tend to be things that aren't as anywhere near as dramatic as you would see in the movies. So it's more about ongoing experiences, and it's more about the feel of those experiences when we talk about the oral tradition. So haunted house movies are really, really fun, and I definitely love hearing about ghost stories. So feel free to share some of those with me, but also hopefully this will help you understand a little bit more about our relationship with haunted houses.